two great speakers representing different parts of the globe. I am delighted to introduce them. We have Barbara Dale Jones. She is one of the directors of a number of organizations, the Field Institute, a global strategy consultancy and digital leadership training institution, Thunder Bay Collective, a reseller and implementation agent of disruptive software, and the Field Lab, a non-profit organization that runs D-Lab, an innovative digital learning program. And she is based in South Africa. So welcome, Barbara. Thank you for joining. We also have Zoe MacLeod. She is the Associate Vice President, Professional and Continuing Studies at Royal Roads University in Canada. She has been leading the development of micro-credentials at Royal Roads University for the past 6 years. And she's got up at 6 a.m. especially to join us, to talk to us today from Canada. Thank you, Zoe. I'm sure everyone will have questions for our speakers, so we have a Q&A session at the end. I'd like to encourage you to send your questions over in the Q&A box or the chat box, which you will find either on the top of your screen or the bottom, depending on what kind of device you're using. And we encourage you to use either one of those. Before we move to our speakers, we have a poll question for you. So Marley, if you could pull that up, that would be great. And the poll question is, please rate your current proficiency in the topic of micro-credentialing by selecting one of these options here. I am not familiar with the concept at all. I have heard of it, but know very little about it. I am familiar with the concept, but I'm unsure of the implementation. Or I'm fully proficient and consider myself an expert. So I'll just give people an opportunity to respond there so we can get the poll result. This is for us to get a better understanding of you as the audience and who are in the room with us today. And while that's coming up, I think I'll start. Marley, you can just put the results up when they're ready. I'll start with the first question while we wait for you to all respond. And I'd like to start with you, Zoe. Before we delve into this, could you please define a micro-credentials? Because many people in our audience, many institutions offer short courses. So is any short course considered a micro-credential?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for the question. It's a tricky question because every country has a different definition at the moment. One of the challenges for sure. We define them as short, assessed, competency-based, industry-aligned offering, and assessment is essential. That's one of the definitions defined by the provincial government here. But really, you want to make sure that they're relevant, that you have accreditation, that they're standardized, that there's assessment, really that there's flexibility, pace or structure of learning could be personalized, and ideally stackable so that they could be combined towards a larger credential, a diploma or a degree. But there are very different definitions across the country in Canada and obviously across the world as well.
Right. Yeah, so it needs, but mainly it needs to be aligned with industry and assessed. And then we'll come back to the stackability of them later. I'm wondering, Marley, if we can show the results of the poll.
Amy, we have received 36% of the audience are not familiar with the concept at all. 54%, so the majority, just over half have heard of it, but they know very little about it. We had nobody indicate that they are familiar with the concept, but they are unsure of the implementation thereof. And then we've had 9% of respondents saying that they are fully proficient in the topic and they consider themselves an expert. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Marley. So for the first two groups, I can say you are definitely in the right place to learn about micro-credentials. And the last 9%, maybe in the Q&A we can have a discussion on the furthering it. So I'll come back. So going back to our discussion, Zoe, now that we've defined micro-credentials, I want to ask you, why do you think micro-credentials are so important and gaining so much attention now? Why all this hype suddenly?
Sure. Well, I think it's for a variety of reasons. I think COVID helped amplify the need for getting people back to work with new and different skills. But for the first time in a long time, at least in Canada anyway, we're in a labor market that used to be demand driven, and we are now in a supply driven labor market. So there are not enough people for the jobs that we have, and not enough skilled people for the jobs that are available. So, the pace of change is rapid, as you all probably are aware, almost at the speed of light these days. And people are needing new skills constantly. Upskilling and reskilling is needed, and in a much more flexible and agile way, perhaps, than 10 years ago. I think industry is really driving some of this, and they're able to utilize micro-credentials to gain the skills they need in their workforce, and they can also be used to attract and retain and upskill employees. I think one of the interesting challenges that we face is that the jobs of the future have not even been created yet. We don't know what those pathways are, and so we need to start building things that are flexible and agile. So I think that's one of the reasons, or many of the reasons.
Yeah, so going to this point of industry and, well, not finding the jobs they need and not even enough people. So how would you define then the benefits? What benefits do you see to offering micro-credentials in that context?
Yeah, it's certainly multifold for sure. People are busy and time-starved. The ability to gain new skills in a short period of time can give them an advantage. I think micro-credentials allow employers to find a specific gap or skill that they need, and higher ed has the opportunity to build programming in that space. If they work together, then both benefit. I think also, employees can personalize their learning. They can select short form micro-credentials tailored to their career goals and their responsibilities. And then they're, sort of better prepared to move up or change jobs during their career. And I think the workforce is able to get skilled workers in a particular area that they might need, in a supply-driven market. I think it's increasingly challenging for employers to find the skills and the people that they need with those skills. And so the opportunity to invest in their employees through micro-credentialing is an opportunity.
Right, yeah, so they actually have a credential at the end to prove it.
Yeah.
Right. And what challenges are you seeing in offering micro-credentials?
Well, there's certainly a few challenges. Recognition of a micro-credential. Obviously, we've got a group of folks here, some of them who've never heard of that before. I think employers, if you ask a CEO of an organization whether or not they understand what a micro-credential is, they may not know the answer. But I think we're starting to see a shift here, and this is where it's important for higher education institutions to pay attention. Especially with big organizations like Google or others that are offering internal micro-credentials. Continuing education units in higher educational institutions have been offering micro-credentials for a long time. We just didn't necessarily call them micro-credentials. So I think the nomenclature is changing, and we're aligning. I think another challenge is the industry alignment. This is really key. A big challenge is making sure we're providing the skills that are actually needed in this, rapidly changing work environment. And so sometimes it can be challenging for employers to even just identify what skills their employees are going to need in the coming year. And then we need to be able to match the development pace as well. So it can be really tricky, and we have to be really fast. And higher education institutions haven't always been known to be fast. So we've got some work to do there. And then thirdly, I think, a challenge is policy. How are we creating new learning units that are, portable across higher education institutions? Micro-credentials really should be competency-based. This can be tricky sometimes. We've got some work to do in the policy space. I think there's a few other challenges as well, but we'll probably talk about those coming up.
Oh, come down. Yeah, well, you've brought up some big ones there. Like employers are saying they don't have the skills, but then they don't fully recognize the micro-credentials. And we've got to help them as education institutions on figuring out what those skills are. Big challenges. Okay, at this point, I'd like to look at South Africa now and see if things are the same or different. So I'll come to you, Barbara, and ask you what you think the benefits are to offering micro-credentials, especially in a South African context where the job market might be different, not necessarily a supply-driven market.
Thanks, Amy, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I think many of the things that Zoe has said are exactly the same in South Africa. I think internationally there's a demand for recognizing short and flexible forms of learning, and industry and employers are needing skills-based credentials, and specifically ones that are verified so that they can satisfy the needs of their workplaces. I think, Zoe's right that there's contestation around actually what a micro-credential is. And, we could talk a little bit about that, but I think it's true to say that there's a trend of increasing interest in micro-credentials, and I think that the education system broadly is being challenged to respond to the demands for new types of education, new types of credentialing. And then obviously a particular challenge is how to fit those with the kind of qualification frameworks and credentialing ecosystems that exist. And I think this is a problem that South Africa's facing, because we have a well constructed national qualifications framework. It's well established. It's a comprehensive system of classification and registration of qualifications and part qualifications. But I think that we've already got a system that you don't really have the registration of international qualifications on the NQF, and you don't have the registration of non-formal and informal qualifications on the NQF. It makes it increasingly and exponentially complex to then incorporate the kind of demand that there is from industry for the micro credential. So
okay, yeah, so a bit quite challenging. And what would you also, how would you say that micro-credentials are maybe helping also with, given the lack of inequality to access to education, unequal access to education? Would you say it would help in that way, in some ways?
Definitely. I think there's a role for micro-credentials in the sort of ensuring equity component of educational access. If you think about the kind of flexibility that micro-credentials allow the individual, by their definition, they're shorter, they're more flexible. I think they offer displaced and vulnerable people more access to the flexible solution to their educational needs. But often, importantly, they're often cheaper because they're shorter and not formal. So I think there is a role for micro-credentials ensuring increased equity and access in education. And I think that we're seeing this in South Africa. So increasingly, the trend that I'm seeing in South African higher education institutions is they're trying to broaden participation. And I think this is a trend across the globe. And the broadening of participation, the widening of the student ecosystem, different kind of courses being offered to to end users is something that's definitely a trend and a change. And I think part of that is, as I said, broadening and changing the ecosystem and ensuring greater access to what has historically been a limited range of access.
Mm-hmm. And you've also touched upon the challenges, like fitting micro-credentials into the very advanced qualification framework that already exists. Are you also seeing the same challenges Zoe was talking about with this tension between, at the employer level, between wanting something but also not fully understanding it? Are you also seeing that?
Yes, I think that's true, and I also think that there's a challenge for, globally, there's this increased need for what the World Economic Forum is talking about, the skills of the future. So the sort of soft intra and extra personal skills, or the transversal skills, or the 21st century skills. And these are things like metacognition and complex problem solving and critical thinking and the ability to work in cross-functional teams. Now, that's a challenge for classification systems to actually accommodate that kind of thing. And to be, measuring and assessing things like individual autonomy or collaborative skills, or digital literacy or so. I think the world of work is laying down a challenge to the education system, as I said earlier, and the education system is having to move quickly in order to adapt. Now, as Zoe said, higher education institutions are not known for their flexibility and speed of movement. So there's an immediate tension.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Would you say you're seeing, though, a bit of a change here in South Africa? And the initiative I'm thinking of here is the PSET Cloud that I know you're a part of. Do you see change there? And maybe you could elaborate a bit on that initiative, because I think the audience might find that helpful and interesting.
Yes, thank you. The PSET Cloud project, and I'll share the URL in the chat shortly, is a national project that's currently being undertaken with the MERSETA as its champion and early adopter. The MERSETA, I'm sure many of the audience will know, but for those who don't, is the Manufacturing and Engineering Sector Education and Training Authority in South Africa. And they're the early adopter of what is a project that's now 4 years in the making and is creating an interoperable digital ecosystem for post-school education and training. And it's addressing all of these types of training categories, the formal, the informal, and the non-formal, in order that individual citizens can build up a profile of their skills in ways that are seamless and take away the pain points historically associated with this, and allow them to demonstrate to the world of work everything that, all of their skills, knowledge, and competency, from formal qualifications, through to sort of short micro-credentials or short courses that the gig economy is requiring. So the PSET Cloud is ensuring the interoperability of what have historically been siloed data sets in South Africa, and ensuring that they're integrated and accessible to the end user. And another important thing is the change in agency that it's enabled, where the individual citizen is at the center of the data paradigm in this project, able to access their data, able to own their data, able to control who sees their data. Now, obviously, this kind of project is possible because of new developments in technology, which have, responded to and also caused new thinking. So something like the blockchain or AI, they're both fundamental to this kind of project and the thinking that goes behind this kind of project. But without going into all the technicalities, the fundamental premise of this project is that there should be self-sovereign identity, that each individual South African citizen should have sovereignty over and agency over their own data, and that their credentialing data, their evidence of their skills, knowledge, and competency through all forms of learning can be evidenced by them in order that they can access the jobs that the country needs them to fill.
Right. Okay. This sounds like an amazing initiative. I'm just going to clarify and make sure that I got this. So it's an app which graduates and the education institutions and employers would have access to find each other. So if I were a graduate, let's say with a high school degree, and I had a micro credential on something like software programming, let's say, I could upload those qualifications and find a relevant job, and the potential employer could then see that my qualification is verified because I've consented to that. So instead of going through a huge bureaucratic process, we can do this online.
You've articulated it very well, and it's exactly that kind of thing. It's in development currently, so there's going to be the launch in 2023 of the minimum viable product, and it'll go to market at that point. So it's not currently existing as an app, but this is what's under development, and there are many similar kind of initiatives globally. So Canada, for example, has the MyCreds initiative, where students or citizens are able to have a credential wallet, a digital credential wallet, and demonstrate their credentials in a similar way. What I think is very exciting about the PZ Cloud in South Africa is that we really being innovative with how we're thinking about data ownership and also data governance, and we're looking to a very decentralized model using innovative approaches like decentralized autonomous organizations and so on.
Right, that sounds awesome.
I'll leave it at that for this moment without going into too much detail.
Yeah, no, it sounds like an amazing initiative. Would be great if you could share the website on the chat. And it sounds like South Africa is moving in the direction to create a very good context for micro-credentialing. And this brings me to another topic. We'll just stay on South Africa again for the time being, and that's the regulatory framework. So what's the regulatory framework like in South Africa regarding micro-credentials? Specifically, does it allow the granting of a credential based on a short course? And does it, and going back to the point Zoe brought up in the definition of stackability, does it allow stacking? So can I get a micro-credential from different places and create a degree? Or can a university accept my micro-credential and build up and give me a degree?
So, as I said earlier, the NQF is a well-established system in South Africa, and it has always allowed for the idea of the stacking of credentials and skills, knowledge, and competency, and the idea of the mobility and portability of learning, across learning pathways and so on. So that's well established. What is not as well established, I'm sorry about the dog, who's wanting to make a point. What is not as well established is how you include in that the informal and the non-formal. So, as I said to you, earlier, there is you can go through a process with both international qualifications, which are not registered on the NQF but are evaluated by the South African Qualifications Authority. And similarly with the non-formal and informal, you can go through that kind of process, but there's still a fair degree of kind of manual engagement around that. And the easy stackability and putting that together into a coherent, let's say, whole qualification is complicated, although sort of philosophically allowed for in terms of how the system is structured. But I think that's what the South African education system is currently grappling with. The higher education, the Department of Higher Education and Training, DHET in South Africa, is currently working on its position paper. It's sent out a first draft already of its first position paper on micro-credentials, and that's, I think, is going to go out to public comment soon. And it's aware that there needs to be some form of recognition for short and flexible learning units that are what industry needs, what the world of work needs, and that are assessed against transparent standards and awarded by a trusted quality assurance body. And I think it's very important what Zoe said earlier about there being some form of assessment related to the micro-credential. But we need to find ways of ensuring that the standards are transparent and as I said, that they're awarded by a trustworthy quality assurance body.
Right. So so the public sector and other stakeholders are clearly moving in that direction and thinking about it. Good to hear. So Zoe, I'd like to ask about Canada now. So in Canada, does the regulatory system allow for stacking and using external micro-credentials alongside university courses to create a program? And is it actually practiced, or is it also just too tricky in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly allowed. Our frameworks are intended for students to have mobility. It's just sometimes individual institutions don't have processes and policies in place. We do this work, and I think a lot of it has to do with prior learning recognition in each institution and how each institution manages that process. For many years, we've always, at least at Royal Roads, we've tried to align with industry associations. For example, project management program would align with the Project Management Institute, etc. So, it feels pretty natural for us to be able to do that. I think what's tricky is, in the past, higher educational institutions have really set up some of this transferability for credit offerings. And if we are talking about non-credit versus credit, that is now kind of an interesting thing where we're starting to think about how are our non-credit frameworks transferable across other institutions as well. So there's some work to do, but I would say we are moving fast towards making some changes in the higher education landscape to accommodate for this. I think those who are progressive are starting to see that there is a need and that institutions are looking to be much more flexible to suit the needs of the learner in today's world.
Right. And on that, could you, again, for the benefit of our audience, maybe people that are thinking about moving forward on this, could you give us an example and walk us through your thought process when, let's say, you're creating a new program and you want to outsource courses because the changes are just happening too fast? Which kind of program would you go for? How would you think about outsourcing courses to micro-credential providers, third parties?
Sure. I think that areas that move really fast or that there's quick change, technology obviously is a good example, because by the time an institution has staffed up, has hired the required people with the required skills, perhaps technology has already moved on. So working with and aligning with our industry partners who are doing this work, maybe it's digital marketing or digital business or something in that space, software development, web development. Why wouldn't we work with those who are already doing that work instead of recreating the wheel? So I think there's advantages in both ways to either endorse or recognize the skills and abilities of our colleagues in the sector. And then vice versa, for them to actually recognize the credential and send their employees to a program that we're collaborating on, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you for that, Zoe. And here I'd like to play, I know we've been talking about the benefits of micro-credentialing, how to do it, but I'd like to play devil's advocate and say that maybe this is a trend that universities and colleges should be fighting, because micro-credentials only cater to the demands of the market, as you've both indicated is very is an essential part of micro-credentialing. So, but education is meant to provide young people with a strong foundation of knowledge in all areas, and that's what a liberal education is. And that's the kind of education that creates a well-rounded person that can take on any different challenge in different fields, not a specific one. And micro-credentials might not be the right way to go for that objective, the objective of education institutions. Zoe, would you like to reflect on that? And then I'd also ask Barbara to reflect on that as well.
I think it's an interesting time. There's a perception that the value of a degree is shifting. I think it's more about the time it takes to earn a degree and the process in which you earn a degree. So not to say that the value of education and the way that higher education institutions offer learning, it is invalid. I think it's just that the way in which we approach it is changing. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and. I think we won't be able to get away from building more short stackable offerings. And I think it matches the relevancy for the industry. So I think again, like I say, it's not either or, it's both and.
Okay, so as in, it wouldn't just be, we wouldn't focus on one objective, it would be both. You're the well-rounded person and somebody that can deal with industry. Okay, thank you very much for that. Barbara, could I ask you for your thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a debate that's, this isn't the first time this debate has emerged in the history of education, and I'm a great believer in the importance of a foundational education and the liberal arts, and I myself have a master's degree in English literature, even though I'm a digital strategist. However, I think that there is a need for higher education institutions to ensure that their graduates are work ready. And, the world of work doesn't have time often to wait for long learning and development processes. And the world is changing, and it's changing more quickly than any of us can really cope with. So I think the danger of HEIs resting on their laurels and saying, well, we provide a one type of learning and we shouldn't change that, is that they're going to be rendered redundant, or at least less utilized by the sector. Now, that said, I think there are many employers who still feel that degrees and work experience are the evidence of an individual's knowledge, skill, and competency. So I don't think that the world has changed entirely, but increasingly we're seeing organizations like Amazon, for example, saying we don't need degrees. In fact, we'd maybe rather not have degrees. So I think there's a tension here for higher education institutions. On the one hand, they have their mandate to provide a rounded set of inputs into the development of young people, but at the same time, they do need to respond to the world in which they exist.
Right. Yes. So it's again the point of both, like a well-rounded personality. You can get that through English literature, but you also need to be able to address the needs of the market. Thank you.
And if I can make one further point, Amy, I think that we also in a very different space now with education from the one that certainly I grew up in, where the idea was that you did a qualification after you left school and then you went into the world of work. We're now in the world of lifelong learning and life-wide learning. And not only do we not know what the jobs of the future are, but we don't know what our own roles in our future will be. So it feels that there's a need for there's a time and there's a need for qualifications, but there's also a time and a need for the kind of flexible learning pathways that our modern circumstances require.
Right. Yes, we live in an uncertain world and we need education institutions to help us with this. Okay, so I'd like to talk about a different topic now. I mean, within this context, obviously, the elephant in the room, and that is funding, because I know this is a question that many people in our audience will be thinking about. So I'll ask Zoe first about the Canadian context. Can you tell us how that works? How does the funding for micro-credential works? And are there any innovative models you've seen to solve the funding problem?
Sure. Well, certainly in Canada, there has been a lot of investment in micro-credentials. This sort of started really at the onset of COVID. So we were really trying to find ways to prepare people who might have lost their jobs or transferred to different sectors and industries. So we needed to get them different skills. So our government actually, both Canadian and provincial, created opportunities for higher education institutions to access funding for the development of micro-credentials. We're starting to see an investment needs to happen somewhere. It's either, at the government level, at the educational institution, at the industry level, or some other perhaps private sector source. But one model that we're starting to see, especially if there is funding available from the government, is that there really needs to be an alignment with industry. So in order to get funded, you need to have an industry partner. So the industry has identified that there is a skill or a gap and that they would be paying for training later. So, the government would support some funding for the development of the program, and industry would pay for their employees to take the program to ensure that they have skills. There are some challenges around this, and we're starting to see some progress here around how do individuals access funding for micro-credentials? And typically a micro-credential wouldn't have fit into the sort of scholarship and bursary or awards space. In Ontario, east of us, they have been progressive in that space where they have added micro-credentials into a funding pool, so students can access funding to take them. We haven't yet got there in British Columbia. I sit on an advisory council for the province, and so I imagine that will get suggested as a model. But there is the idea, I think, that we will see lots more employer-paid upskilling and reskilling as we sort of transition into micro-credential offerings.
Right, yes, this partnership with industry where they're actually funding to some extent, at least. And thank you for bringing up that differentiation between funding for institution and individual, because they're two different things. Barbara, how is the funding? How does the funding work in South Africa? Because it's my understanding that public funding again would only be available for certifications like Canada. And how does that work?
Well, that's not entirely true. We have a system in South Africa where companies pay a skills levy. I think it's 1% of turnover, and that's channeled through the sector education and training authorities like the MERSETA that I mentioned earlier. And companies then need to plan within their sector for the training and development they'll do with staff, and they can claim against the skills levy, and that's the sort of funding mechanism against which they can claim and draw. Now, you are able to include all kinds of learning in that, both formal qualifications as well as informal and non-formal. So it does allow for funding flows in all the different categories. However, what I will say is that I think the South African system privileges the longer or more formal types of qualifications. So, and one of the main drivers of this, I think, is the Black Economic Empowerment scorecard against which companies need to report, which privileges, for example, gives more ranking on the scorecard for things like learnerships, which are longer forms of qualification, where a student will typically spend 18 months or 2 years in a lengthy learnership that has a theoretical component and a workplace component and so on. That would typically be an approach that an employer would favor rather than a short course or a micro-credential, because of the kind of scorecard status they'd get and consequently the kind of skills levy rebate that they would get. But it's not impossible to have the funding for micro-credentials or short courses.
And have you seen examples, like, despite this incentive, that industry are coming in, are coming in to finance shorter courses that they see are needed?
Indeed. I mean, you mentioned when you introduced me that one of the companies that I run is a non-profit organization, and we have a huge demand for what is a learning program, a short learning program that we run for unemployed youth. And we having mainstream banks and insurance companies and so on requiring that, needing that, even though it's not a full learnership or a full qualification. It's something that they see as just-in-time learning and absolutely vital for developing the kind of pipeline that they need into their workplace. And these are exactly the organizations that are saying things like, we can't wait 6 years to have skilled people in our workplace. We can't wait 6 years before we're able to bill for the work of our young developers or young engineers. And so they're increasingly looking at these kinds of add-ons for young graduates.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, there is some engagement there. So I think it's time to move to our Q&A. We have a couple of questions here. I'll start off, actually one of them rides off what you were just talking about, Barbara, and that's engagement with industry. The question is, what's the role of professional bodies or industry associations in micro-credentials?
Yeah, I think that's a real opportunity for micro-credentials, is in the area of work-based learning and continuing professional development, and developing this sort of skills portfolio of people within a particular ecosystem. Like, I think this question was related to the health departments, but it could be across a range. And you know, I mean, I think we already see short courses being used in the pursuit of continuing education points. But I think you've got a real opportunity with micro-credentials for there to be demand-driven, industry-led, properly assessed, recognized short pockets of learning, and that ultimately are stackable. And can be put together into either a qualification or a profile of skills, knowledge, and competence.
Right, thank you for that. And then I'll also ask Zoe just to comment on that. Like, how does since your university is already engaging quite heavily in micro-credentialing and has been for a while, how do you engage with industry?
Yeah, it really will depend on the industry and the topic area. One I can give you an example is we worked with an organization who had a competency framework around climate adaptation. And we know that we need to build skills in this space across all of us. We all need this learning. The world is changing, and we need to all be thinking about climate adaptation in new and different ways. It's almost like the new digital skills toolkit. We need to understand climate. So, you know, we really worked closely with industry to align our courses and programs, ultimately stacking into a micro-credential with the competency framework that already existed. So I think that's really key, is to find those areas where competency is required in the workforce and build, as Barbara said, pockets of learning that focus on those specific competencies.
Thank you for that, Zoe. So we have another question here. I'll read it out, and I think this is directed at Barbara because it's in the South African context. I find challenges with some SETAs and the insistence on unit standards and skill programs with work integrated learning. Further, the influence that some SETAs have on employers with outdated information, not always understanding the higher education environment. Do you also find this? And if so, how do you deal with it?
I think there's been a terrible bureaucratization of the system in South Africa. And I find it deeply regrettable because I think the philosophies of the National Qualifications Framework and the precepts on which it's built are ones that I admire. But I think the lived application can be very frustrating if you're trying to navigate, and very bewildering if you're trying to understand. I think, in general, there's a need to simplify this process and make it less bureaucratic and less frustrating. But in the context of our discussion this afternoon, I think there's a vital and urgent need to look at how we recognize learning beyond the structured national qualifications framework. We need to be able to understand how we recognize short, non-formal and informal learning experiences that target particular competences and skills. And we need to know that we can ensure the kind of recognition and validation and portability of these things so that there can be alternative ways of achieving learning. And it's my belief that we must make this much more learner-centered and accessible. So I spoke about the equity point and the access point earlier, and then I also spoke about the need for a learner-centered approach. And I really believe this to be the case, that we've got to sort of flip this model away from a sort of frustrating, bureaucratic kind of top-down driven process and look much more at the role of the individual in meeting our labor needs as a country and helping to ensure our economic future. And we can only do that by changing these models to be more learner-centered.
Thank you for that, Barbara. And I was going to ask Zoe maybe to reflect on this in the Canadian context, meaning you've been doing this for a while now, and I don't know whether the structure or the framework was always so helpful, especially before COVID. Could you reflect on that and how you as a university moved forward?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, Royal Roads is a young institution. We just recently celebrated 25 years, and the point of the institution was to focus on mid-career professionals. And so we really did put the learner at the center. I think over time we start to navigate that tension between traditional or innovative. We need to be traditional in order to be seen as, valid, and yet the innovation piece is where we really excel. So for us, we've always had a flexible assessment process. I think that's a key part of the institution where if you didn't have a degree, we would look at your prior learning experience and assess it and say, yes, we'll utilize that learning towards acceptance into a program. So at the very nature of our being was this flexible approach. So it wasn't difficult for us to start thinking about how can we build out short programs that stack into degrees and build non-credit to credit pathways and really move the needle in that way. It's still tricky, right? We still have to fit the into the systems that exist, and where they don't fit, we need to change structure and policy, and we still will have sort of that bureaucracy that needs to be addressed. But I think the intent is for us to actually be leading the way in this space. So it's a pretty exciting time for educational institutions writ large. Even from a K-12 perspective, we're seeing curriculum change. We're seeing education looking at problem-based learning as opposed to, you must take this one course as part of an elective in your program in order to, right? And 4 years later, it has no relevance. Like, let's get rid of some of those things so that we're actually building students of the future.
Right. Thank you, Zoe. And I have another question here, and it's actually very related to the PSET cloud, Barbara. And the question is, so as an education institution, how do I play a role in this initiative?
Well, that's a great question. And the most immediate answer is we're going through a process of design thinking as we build this, by which I mean that we are speaking to the stakeholders the most involved, one of whom is education and training providers or education institutions. And we'd love you to be part of workshops that help us to understand what your needs are, what your lived reality is, and what your pain points are in order that the PSET Cloud can help to solve that. But in turn, as we release our MVP to market, we'd also love you to test it and to be part of that kind of feedback loop as we improve and validate the work that we're doing. So I'm happy to share my email address in the chat as well, Amy, if that's appropriate, and people can contact me to do that if they'd like to.
That would be great. Thank you, Barbara. And then we have another question, which is like a step back, and maybe again I'll ask both of you to comment on this. Is according to your description, yes, we are already offering these short courses, and maybe they're called micro-credentials. What is your advice for a college or university that wants to start offering micro-credentials? Given that they're already offering short courses, how do we make that leap?
Yeah, I'm happy to just start. Thanks, Barbara. Just quickly, I think the first place to start is to get more connected to industry. Go out and start building those relationships because you're going to need to know what their challenges are. And even as Barbara is talking about the design thinking process, this is the opportunity to be closer connected to industry and professional bodies. And I think that's building those relationships are key. And I would also offer collaboration across post-secondary institutions. Start seeing how you can work closer together, in service of a learner.
Okay, so mainly building that connection with industry. Go out there and talk to them. Okay, I just have a follow-up question on that before I'd like to ask Barbara to also comment. And do you have any strategies like on doing that? Would it be at a department, like maybe a few tips on how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly your organization probably already has existing relationships and partners. Why not start there? It's much more challenging to sort of just go, oh, I don't know where to start. I'm just going to randomly pick an industry. What are you already good at, and build on those strengths.
Thank you. Okay, and Barbara, would you like to comment on that? The question.
I would agree with Zoe's position. Start with the user's outcomes and work backward from there. So talk to industry and talk to employers and understand what their needs are, and then try and solve for those needs. And as well as that, be agile, by which I mean be able to change quickly, but also keep moving and developing and changing as the circumstances and needs on the ground change. And then, maybe a third point, I think it's very helpful for institutions to also think about how micro-credentials can be accumulated and then not only stacked together into, small smaller than qualifications maybe, but also how they can be articulated into qualifications, into sort of undergraduate and graduate programs. So think about them not only as standalone micro-credentials, but also how they can be articulated into the other kinds of programs that you as an institution might run.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Okay, so we're coming to an end of our webinar, so we're going to have to wrap up now, unfortunately. But we've learned some great points about what exactly a micro-credential is and how it can help with some bigger social problems like unequal access to education, the need to reskill professionals whose skills are no longer needed in the market. As both our speakers indicated, we live in an uncertain world, so that's going to happen more and more often, and how universities and colleges can leverage these credentials to make their students more employable. I'd like to thank our guest speakers, Barbara and Zoe. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope you now have some good ideas to move forward. I can see in the chat and the Q&A that this is stirring up some questions and some ideas, that you have some ideas to move forward on utilizing micro-credentials. It's an exciting new space and it's exploding right now. If you have any questions about IFC Vitae program and how we might help your institution on employability outcomes, please don't hesitate to contact us on our website, which is provided in the invite email. And you can also take a free benchmarking exercise on our website. We have one request for all participants. Could you, we're going to be sending out a survey on your satisfaction with this webinar. It will be in your email inboxes in a few minutes. So we'd really appreciate it if you could take just a couple of minutes to fill that in. That really helps us better understand your needs and how we can respond to them. So we're looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.